Okay, I'd like to thank our two speakers for setting the stage for this workshop so well. Judith Kroll demonstrated the richness of the field of bilingualism, independent of its implications for executive function, as well as considering those implications. And Naomi Friedman demonstrated the richness of the field of executive function, independent of its implications for bilingualism, as well as considering those implications. Irina Sakarinas and my goal for this workshop, and NSF's goal, is for these two fields, which have so much to offer each other, to influence each other more. This is a wonderful beginning. Thank you, Judith, and thank you, Naomi. In my discussion today, I'll raise questions for Judith and Naomi about some of the themes that they presented. After that, the remainder of my discussion will focus first on interpretations of neuroscience data, and second on comparisons of bilingualism with other kinds of cognitively challenging experiences. Naomi Friedman brought up three themes that I have questions about. The first theme is that executive functions don't map neatly onto tasks measuring executive functions. Every task is impure, meaning that it tests different aspects of executive functions to different degrees, and also tests cognitive processes that aren't aspects of executive function at all, like visual perception. Tasks that superficially look as if they should correlate don't necessarily correlate. And in general, we don't understand enough about what the different tasks tap. One question I have for Naomi is whether the latent variable analysis that she provides oversimplifies the relations among the variables and the tasks. For example, is it really possible to label most tasks as composed of a general factor plus only one of the two specific factors? And what about the cognitive processes that aren't part of executive functions? A couple of specific comparisons will indicate what I'm after. Consider the Simon and flanker tasks from the point of view of their similarities and differences. Both tasks require the participant sometimes to use one finger on one side of a keyboard and the other finger on a different side, and both tasks have incongruent and congruent trials. But the similarity stops there. The stimuli are different. In some basic forms of the Simon, you've got rectangles, and in basic forms of the flanker, you've got arrows. Sometimes you have fishes, but whatever, you've got things pointing in different directions. One's non-directional, that's the Simon, the other's inherently directional. More important, the incongruency in the flanker has a different source from the incongruency in the Simon. In the flanker, incongruency is due to a conflict between the direction of the target arrow and which is in the focus of attention, and the direction of the arrows that are in the periphery of attention. The congruent item is focal, and the incongruent surround is peripheral. This was pointed out by Guini and Machado. The flanker requires one to ignore the arrows surrounding the target. In the Simon task, incongruency has a different source. It's due to the lack of alignment between the spatial position of the stimulus and the spatial position of the key to be pressed. There's a single stimulus, and it's always in the participant's focal attention, whether it's congruent or incongruent. Another difference is that the Simon requires inhibition of a prepotent response whenever the stimulus is on the other side of the screen from the keyboard response, while the flanker does not, as Poarch and Von Hell have noted. Although these task differences might seem minor, they have consequences. Average reaction time, independent of congruency condition, correlates well between the Simon and the flanker. That is, people who are fast on one are fast on the other. But the cost of incongruency doesn't correlate well between the two tasks. Individuals who show a low cost of incongruency on the Simon do not show a similarly low cost on the flanker. Several people have found that, including my lab, Papen Greenberg, and Poarch and Von Hell. More surprisingly, even the verbal and numerical versions of the Stroop do not correlate significantly with each other, as Dunya Beitia and colleagues found. Since those two tasks are conceptually extremely similar, it's likely that cognitive processes outside of executive function are responsible for the differences in responding. As a result, it's difficult to know whether differences, when they're found, are due to aspects of the task that measure executive functions or to aspects that measure other cognitive processes. So this is a thought about the myriad implications of task impurity and conclusions that we might draw about whether any particular cognitively challenging activity is actually improving executive function or is improving something else. The second theme is the idea of unity and diversity. Naomi addressed the question of whether the common factor should be labeled inhibition, since it maps completely onto what used to be called inhibition. She argues that it should be seen as a common factor, since it is related to all the tasks that have been analyzed. And the way that she defines the common factor is a much more general conceptualization than inhibition, but I wonder whether there are any experimental data that actually bear out talking about it at a more general level as opposed to talking about it at an inhibitory level. The third theme concerns what we should expect from bilingualism on executive function tasks. The tantalizing suggestion that Naomi offered was that bilinguals, at least lifelong balanced bilinguals, are very highly practiced. The exquisite control that Judith Kroll mentions that bilinguals have over which of their languages to use at any given time seems a highly practiced, almost automatic skill, and the change in neurological processing might underline that. Should we expect, then, that the skill involved in suppressing the irrelevant language and switching to it when it's appropriate to do so will be related to performance on executive function tasks, given that the executive function tasks are tapping novel procedures? If we shouldn't expect transfer to executive function tasks, are we wasting our time by examining bilinguals' performance on them? Alternatively, maybe language processing is always more of a controlled process for bilinguals compared to monolinguals. For example, Bialystok notes that bilinguals take longer to understand and produce words than monolinguals do, and that bilinguals are less fluent than monolinguals when they're asked to list, say, as many animals as they can, though that appears to be due to bilinguals' smaller vocabulary. My third question, then, is whether we're looking in the right place for cognitive consequences of bilingualism. Judith Kroll brought up three themes that I have questions about. The first theme is that both of a bilingual's languages are always active. One language has an effect on the other in vocabulary tasks, in grammar tasks, and in phonology tasks. I have several questions about these important findings. First, what are the limits? I know French, kinda, sorta, but I only use it on the all too rare occasions when I'm in a French-speaking country, or when I'm reading a menu in a French restaurant, or when I'm showing off my knowledge of French phrases, which I hope I'll have the opportunity to do sometime later in this workshop. Is my French active when I'm speaking English? Second, bilinguals who actively use their two languages seem highly practiced at switching. Is this an example of a highly automatized procedure that ends up having few implications for cognition? And relatedly, in this area, bilingual babies that Judith referred to, who cannot be said to be inhibiting or updating or switching in the usual sense of those terms, nevertheless appear to show enhanced executive functions. They're able to switch to a new rule more easily than monolingual babies are. What could the underlying mechanism be in those circumstances? The second theme is that the juggling of two or more languages has neural consequences and often, but not always, behavioral consequences. This dissociation between brain and behavior crops up in various areas. My question is about the significance of this fact. One possibility is that neuroscience tells us less than we might have thought about behavior, and I'm going to argue for that later in my comments. Another possibility is that neuroscience work gives us a more sensitive indicator than behavior does of underlying cognitive processes. I think that is an underlying assumption of much work in cognitive neuroscience. My question is how we can decide between those two possibilities on any given occasion. The third theme is that bilingualism may have its parallels in non-linguistic domains, suggesting that the underlying mechanisms, as Judith suggested, are domain general and reflect coordination of control mechanisms rather than simple main effects. The fact that both bilingualism and non-linguistic experiences affect executive functions should have implications for teasing out which aspects of experience matter. What might those aspects be? Okay, those are my three questions for Naomi and Judith. And now I'm going to move on to discuss neuroscience data. I mentioned earlier that neural differences are not always accompanied by behavioral differences. That's true in the domain of cognitive sex differences, as well as the area that Judith was talking about today. The neuroendocrinologist Geert de Vries noted in 2004 that the functional significance of most sex differences in the brain was not known. He writes, "We are heavily invested in the idea that sex differences in brain structure cause sex differences in behavior. We rarely consider the possibility that sex differences in brain structure may also prevent sex differences in overt functions and behavior by compensating for sex differences in physiological conditions." And he gives some examples of that, and as I'm telling you about those examples, I hope you'll keep in mind the possible parallels to the bilingualism case. So de Vries gives the example of prairie voles. They are not bilingual. Both parents take care of the pups, and there are no qualitative differences in parental behavior between males and females, except that females can nurse their young. But the underlying neurohormonal mechanisms are different. Virgin female prairie voles are unresponsive to pups or even infanticidal. But exposure to gonadal steroids during pregnancy makes them behave like good parents, not just nursing, but being parental overall. In males, gonadal steroids don't play a role. Instead, parental behavior depends on activation of arginine vasopressin receptors in the lateral septum. Female voles have hardly any AVP fibers in their septum, whereas males have a dense AVP network. Therefore, de Vries suggests male prairie voles who don't become pregnant and therefore are never exposed to the hormonal changes associated with pregnancy may have compensated by using the male-biased AVP innervation to stimulate parental responsiveness. The underlying neurohormonal mechanism is different in female and male voles, but the behaviors are the same. Similarly, both male and female voles exhibit pair bonding, but the neural substrate is different. In the rat, both males and females are equally good at social recognition memory, but again, the underlying mechanism differs. In humans, strokes in the same brain regions can have different outcomes in men and women, but functional imaging studies suggest that men and women use cortical regions differently, even for functions that don't differ themselves. So this hypothesis having to do with compensation applies equally to any two groups. So for mono and bilinguals, both groups need to be able to carry out executive functions. One group may do it with one set of neural pathways and another group may do it with a different set. How each group's behavior is mediated is, of course, something that we want to understand. But once we entertain the possibility that two groups can accomplish the same task by different means, we no longer have a basis for making clear predictions. Okay, now I want to touch on variability in results with bilinguals. I think variability is considerable in all the populations that have been studied so far, and there have been a number of hypotheses about the sources of that variability. The two logical possibilities that I see are, first, there aren't any cognitive benefits. Second, there is a benefit. Yeah, I'm a very simple-minded person. Okay, so three considerations lead me to favor the second possibility. First, as Naomi Friedman described, executive functions have different components. Depending on the tasks we use to measure executive functions, one or another component may be primary. We don't have a clear enough theory yet to isolate what components of executive function should be most affected by bilingualism. Second, we already know, as Kroll suggested, that a range of experiences is associated with superior executive function, delay of dementia, or both. In addition to language status, factors include socioeconomic status, immigrant status, extent of exercise, presence of musical training, experience with action video games, education level, time spent in leisure activities. And no doubt there are other factors that haven't yet been systematically investigated. Third, when we look at all these cases, whether we're looking at language or the other cases, effects are inconsistent. There is no single effect I've looked at, possibly with the exception of certain kinds of exercise, that always improves executive function. But when they do occur, effects are generally positive. So individuals vary in the types of cognitive challenges that they have, and in any given experiment, we have no way of controlling for all the possible types that the participants in our experiments have. So in any given experiment, bilingualism may be trumped by some other feature that the individuals in that environment have. Judith also suggested that not all monolinguals are the same. I've entertained the possibility that New York monolinguals are different from other monolinguals because we are particularly challenged with, for example, subways that arbitrarily skip stops and have different schedules on weekends, sidewalks that require adroitness to maneuver, and people who exhibit a wide range of behaviors. But maybe New York is too challenging given the range of resources available to people. People live longer in small towns in Colorado and suburbs in Virginia and California than they do in New York. And the percentage of seniors with Alzheimer's is 10% in Colorado, 11% in California and Virginia, and 13% in New York. So having a lot of cognitively challenging activities may be detrimental if you don't also have the resources that will allow you to manage them. So My hypothesis here is that it's the combination of all these facts about executive functions and the manifold tasks, the manifold activities that help executive functions that accounts for the inconsistency in the findings. If this general way of looking at things is correct, then it suggests that there might be a variety of underlying mechanisms that we should be looking for rather than a single mechanism when we're thinking about what the possible executive function advantages are of bilingualism. I'll turn things over now to Judith and Naomi to see if they want to address any of the issues I raised, and then we'll have a general discussion. So, Judith and Naomi, if you could come up to the stage. And there will be, you'll come to the microphones there, so try not just to shout out your answer. Also, please do identify yourself because not everybody will know who you are. Do you want to make any resistance? And we're sitting in a very punishing spot here.
Very bright, very bright.
I don't know if it's possible to turn the projector off.
I think it's these spotlights. Those were a lot of really great questions. I'm not sure I remember all of the ones for me. But I do remember the question about whether these different tasks may be even not loading on the same factor is the general idea. And more different, and more generally, that there even tasks that seem to measure the same thing could have a lot of different things about them. And I think that's probably a reason that we don't find very high correlations among these tasks. Presumably, in this sort of framework that I'm using, that sort of variation would go into that residual component, so that in one of those figures, that 84% or something like that. But I think, and there also could be refinement of the factors. So for example, I had Simon loading on a distractor factor, but I actually not sure that I would have done a factor like that because I think the Simon task does involve some sort of prepotent response. So we may want to kind of group that if we think we want to distinguish between prepotent and sort of neutral distraction, things like that. So I think, how you pick your tasks is really important. But even when we pick tasks that are very similar, we find these low correlations among tasks. And I think it's particularly bad for the inhibition factor. Tasks like working memory tasks, things like that, we can find pretty robust correlations. Switching tasks also pretty robust correlations. So it's really this inhibition factor, which I think is quite unfortunate because we have a lot of hypotheses about inhibition. And so, I think I mostly just agree with you that that there's a lot of task impurity, and that maybe you can separate it out if you look at the common variants, but as you've seen, that's quite difficult. So, and then I think you also had a question about
inhibition versus common factor.
Can you remind me?
Well, you are loath to call it inhibition. You're loath to call the common factor inhibition. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how would you make the decision that it should be called, given the gloss that you give it, rather than something simpler like inhibition?
Well, I think I started out asking, is there evidence that maybe there's a common, if we're going to call this inhibition, that there is something that it's really the same factor in all of these different kinds of tasks. And in one of those studies that I showed you, I sort of looked at that actually for my dissertation, and I didn't find that there was actually evidence that they all were sort of tapping the same thing. So that's one piece of evidence, but it's only from an individual differences standpoint. I think part of what makes me go back and forth on this issue is that I think there's a lot of work that shows that you don't necessarily need an inhibition mechanism to sort of account for the patterns that we see. And I find that quite persuasive in my own work because I've been doing some computational modeling to kind of see if the kind of mechanisms that I'm positing would drive these patterns actually could reproduce these same patterns. And so I've found some, but of course that doesn't mean that I couldn't be wrong about those mechanisms. So I feel like I can't solve the inhibition debate right now, but I think it's definitely important to consider whether, there is some evidence that we would really be able to say definitely comes down on this side.
Okay, I think I'd like to start by addressing your French. And, right, so pardon your French. Right. I think that there is obviously in the context of a brief talk that was comprehensive, it was impossible to go to different factors. There is a very rich literature, as many of you know, on the consequences of age of acquisition, proficiency, and all of these things. And I think that for the present purpose, I don't think that, and I think there's a lot of evidence that someone with your level of French might not show all of these effects in quite the same way. But I also think, and the data that I presented from the Osterhout lab suggests that, in fact, there might be some measures that do show that sensitivity. But here's the point. The point is that I think when we started this whole investigation, we thought that there would be a developmental trajectory of these consequences, and that what we would see is that you would achieve some level of automaticity and you might not see the same requirement. And the result that's really quite remarkable is that we continue to see these effects in highly proficient speakers. Now, it's really important to point out, and we have and other people have in the literature, that what the patterning of those consequences are may be quite different for people who are learners at early stages and for people who are quite proficient and have achieved some level of automaticity in the two languages. Or there are very few really balanced bilinguals, but people who are more balanced than not. So I don't think anyone would deny that. At the same time, the fact that we see these consequences and the experiments that I reported today showing that the L2 comes to affect the L1, these are all highly proficient bilinguals. So these were not learners. So I think that's important to say that there's something here about the need for regulation that does not go away. It may change in its pattern, but it's not eliminated by virtue of achieving proficiency, however we want to define that. I think that I'd like to address your point about the neuroscience. And I think, and I guess the way I would characterize this is to say that, first of all, we can't just say cognitive neuroscience, because looking at temporally sensitive measures like electrophysiology, looking at imaging, and then you can look at functional imaging, you can look at structural imaging, we're looking at different time courses, different spatial locations. I think we're talking about many, many different things. What's striking is that we sometimes see dissociations and we sometimes see convergence. And I think the question we need to ask is not simply about mechanism, it's about having models. It's about having models that allow us to begin to understand how a converging methodologies may result in patterns that enable us to understand what is happening when. I think we tend to make rather linear assumptions in these models, and I think one of the things that the data that we have now suggests is that that linearity is wrong. And I don't think we've yet gotten to a point of having a model that goes beyond saying these are not one-to-one relationships, and we need to then be able to understand how that's going to work and take all of the kind of complexity that you talked about into account. I don't think we're anywhere near having that. I think what we have is we have a sampling, we have a palette where we have a sampling of what these relationships might look like. And I think they provide clues to us about where we want to look and I think asking the question, another way to reframe the question is to say, can we identify the principled distinctions between the cases where we see convergence and the cases where we don't? And I think, I don't think we know the answer to that question. I want to make one other comment, and it relates to the question that you had for Naomi about inhibition. I think there's a lot of confusion about inhibition, and a question that I get asked over and over and over again is, I say, how can you use the word inhibition? I mean, inhibition is sort of a hot potato word, and I think part of the confusion in this particular literature on bilingualism and executive function is a confusion between language control and cognitive control. And I think that we're arguing that language imposes cognitive demands that affect the networks that are shared with these cognitive tasks, but it doesn't mean it does that in exactly the same way. So I can envision a system where there is a need for inhibition of the sort of the suppression type phenomena that I reported on, that in fact have implications for the cognitive network or the neural network that themselves are not inhibitory. Mm-hmm. Okay, that they tune mechanisms that create activation of a sort that are not necessarily inhibitory, but that we need to think about these things in a more nuanced way than we have.
Okay, please do ask your questions and go to the microphone. And we do want to have as many people asking questions as possible, since the whole point of this is to have a diverse group of people talking to each other. So keep your questions as compact, cordial, and comprehensive as possible. And please identify yourselves.
Thank you. Is this turned on?
Yes.
I'm Ellen Bialystock. Thank you. I have a question for Virginia. Thank you very much for that summary. I'm struck by the 3 reasons you gave to explain your preference for the position that bilingualism does not have an impact on cognition in general, and I suppose executive function more particular.
But wait, you used a negative, and I was arguing for the affirmative.
Well, okay, I've cast it incorrectly. It's your 3 points that I wish to ask you about.
Okay.
Your 3 points were, if the behavior is the same, then potential brain differences really are not very interesting because the same outcome was achieved, and you gave several examples. Your second point was that other experiences also have impacts on cognition, so there's nothing special about bilingualism. And finally, you pointed out correctly that these effects are inconsistent. Now, when you put these together, it seems to me what you need is much more research rather than what I understand your point to be, which is the conclusion that there really is nothing here that comes out that we need to be looking at. So I did understand your point to be that your preference was for the position that there are not substantial effects of bilingualism. If I misunderstand that, I apologize. Nonetheless, I would like you to explain how these 3 points lead to the conclusion.
Okay. My argument, which is also in the keynote that I wrote for bilingualism, language, and cognition, is that there are effects, and the fact that the effects are inconsistent effects shouldn't make us think that they're non-existent. That there are a lot of reasons for those effects to be inconsistent, such as task variability and impurity, and the multiple nature of executive functions themselves. That's one point. The other point is almost everything that we know about that seems to have a positive effect on executive function has inconsistent effects. They're generally positive if they do occur, but often there aren't any effects. So unless we would want to say, which I wouldn't want to say, that nothing has an effect, we are forced to say they all have inconsistent effects, and in any given experiment, you don't know what the sample characteristics are, such that you may or may not have an effect. With respect to the brain, my point there was that we should take the brain differences that we see, especially when they don't correlate with behavior, as letting us know that brains have many different ways of getting the same behavioral result. So we do want to understand the relation between how the brain is operating and how behavior is operating, but if we're looking at behavior, a given behavior's compatibility with a variety of different neural hormonal mechanisms says to me that we're not always seeing something that's more sensitive when we look at the brain. We're just seeing another way of doing it. And that's more evident in the sex differences literature, but I think it applies to the bilingualism literature.
Hi, my question is for Dr.
Could you
Cole.
identify yourself?
My name is Felicida Garcia, and I'm a doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University. I'm doing a dissertation on dialect, American English dialect, so you can see where my angle is. My question was, I wrote it, how much of the implications provided by the bilingualism research do you think can be applied to bidialectal groups, or would these groups be better sorted under the Pacalic and Neville's consideration that not all monolinguals are the same?
Yeah, there's obviously has not been quite as much work on bidialectalism, but there's a lot of interest in it. The work that I know of, and certainly open this to others in the audience who may have more information about this, is I think there's no reason to think that it couldn't be quite similar, and that in fact you might expect the magnitude of it depending on the context, because again you have these contextual differences in how the languages are used that may differ. But I would say that you should see very many of the same phenomena.
I would say my pilot data would say the same. Thank you.
Yeah, Randy Engel. I first want to thank you for 3 really good talks. Very clear-headed and made sleeping in the pod worthwhile.
What was that?
I said made sleeping in the pod worthwhile.
Oh, okay.
First of all, it seems there are a couple of points that I'd like to make, and Judy, I want to get your reaction to. It seems to me that when you talk about inhibition, as you said, that gets you into there are a lot of cognitive psychologists, smart people that you and I both know, who say there's no such thing as inhibition. Really smart people who I know and respect who say there is such a thing as inhibition. Strikes me that part of the problem is that there are these functions that can be achieved in a variety of ways. And on the one hand, it may make no difference whatsoever. So for example, if I'm bilingual and I'm actually dampening a representation in Dutch for bicycle, that might have a consequence. Or if, on the other hand, I have retrieved it and I'm doing what Jim Neely calls backward checking, both are going to slow me down, aren't they? And so they're going to look like inhibition, but one we would probably technically define as inhibition, one not. But dealing with them both is probably going to be beneficial maybe in some other cases.
If I can just say one thing about this. I think that there are studies that are emerging. I think one of the problems is you're quite right when you have effects that where you don't have the measures that would allow you to know which is which. But I think we're beginning to have those measures. Yeah. So for example, when a person who's much more dominant in their first language than their second, which is true for almost all bilinguals, you have to ask the question of whether you're preparing, whether you're activating the second language, or whether you're dampening the first in exactly the way you've stated. I think we have evidence now suggesting that both of those processes are occurring, and that they have some different time course. And I think it requires a much more nuanced approach to this, to really look at how this happens, characterizing the nature of that relationship between the two languages, and characterizing what the time course looks like.
I think that's exactly right. The other thing is that, we, the psychologists, at least in this room who do behavioral studies, we've got a really tough thing to do here, to look at a very intricate and fine-tuned mechanism with a really, really nasty microscope, right? And the tools that we use, these tasks that we use, as Naomi, I think, beautifully showed, you're looking at variance, reliability estimates for a task. The Stroop, I use it all of the time in my huge scale structural equation modeling studies, but the reliability of that task is just abysmal. And so you can't really expect to find consistently great effects with a task that is low reliability. So we really are expecting an awful lot out of our discipline to show a consistency, which I think is what Virginia talked about, is, when you see these effects, they're in a given direction. They're rarely in the other direction that I'm aware of. But we shouldn't be surprised that if you have effects that are not large, and with tasks that are unreliable, and all of these tasks have a fairly high level of unreliability, particularly if you use them at the single task level, that you're going to see inconsistencies. Would you agree? I'll sit down.
What do you mean by the single task level, Randy?
Well, if somebody is using just the Stroop as their indicator, as opposed to the way Naomi talked about it at the latent structure level, where you've got multiple tasks, and even there, what she showed is that, if you get something like antipsychotic, Stroop, and one other thing, and each of them has a loading of about 0.3 to 0.4, 0.3 means that less than 10% of the variance in that task is attributable to this function, right? So you've got to have a very, very fine instrument to detect that 10%. Right? And there are a lot of other ways that can affect performance on that task. Performance is always multiply determined. There's no task that I can think of in all of cognitive psychology that is always singly determined. We human beings are very, very flexible, and voles are too, clearly, in doing things in a variety of different ways. So it makes it a very, very difficult thing to do, to be with any certitude for or against these things anyway. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. So don't worry, Virginia. I will, Isabelle Barrière, I will not comment on Virginia's French. That's not the point of my question. But I have two different sets of questions. So one is for Naomi Friedman. The little I understand from the literature on the development of executive function in young children shows that there are effects of SES, okay? So there are also effects of SES on, it seems to be some specific aspects of language development. But when we find these effects on language development, we are quite good at tying them. We're becoming better at tying them as very specific aspects of the environment, like the number of words children hear, etc. Okay, it seems to me that the literature, and that's a little bit the point that Virginia was making about living in New York as opposed to other places, that there are some environmental factors that may be involved, and it doesn't seem to me that they are very well understood or identified. And given this, does that mean that when you do your genetic studies of your population, it's very hard to characterize them with respect to the environment? So that was my first question. My second set of questions is to a point that Judith made. So I'm asking this from the point of view of somebody who, I not only I learn languages, but I learn to read them. And when we define heritage language learner, part of it is in relation to literacy skills. So when you say what really matters is, speaking, I feel like, well, I'm not sure this is the full answer. Maybe it is that we know better how to study that. I understand with writing is a very slow activity, but I would like to know if, my effort in learning to read Hebrew, etc., makes a difference, or even working with languages that are very close orally but not in spelling, it's a very specific effort. So I just wondered if it's really only speaking matters or we know better how to investigate it. So these are my two sets of questions.
Maybe Naomi can address the first question.
So as I understand the first question, you're asking, have we quantified some of the environmental factors that can influence cognitive ability and executive function? And from at least the perspective of the kind of work that I do, where we might have, so all the environmental factors that I showed you were just sort of at this amorphous, it's just environment level. People have tried to quantify, at least when we have, for example, non-shared environments, so environmental factors that are unique to people, which seem to be more important for a lot of traits than shared environments, at least later in life. And I think that the general take home there is that it's quite hard there to find an environmental factor that accounts for a lot of variance. So you might get 1% of the variance, 2%, and maybe if you had a whole bunch of them, they would add up to the total variance we know is there, but it's quite hard to identify any particular number of books in the house or, those sorts of measures that really would account for that. So I feel like I would like to know more about what are some of these environmental factors that we could identify that might influence executive function, but I don't know of any right now that are very, very strong effects.
On the second question about literacy, and I think I want to be clear that I wasn't saying that speaking is the basis of these effects. It's that it has been hypothesized to be critical because of the selection factor, but I think that there are many issues about acquiring literacy. I think there are many contexts of bilingualism that provide really interesting opportunities for us to investigate all of these other issues. So for example, when you have a heritage speaker who then typically may have a home language, go to school at age 5 or 6, and then be thrust into immersed in a second language that is the majority language in the culture, that what you may see is you see typically a reversal of language dominance. Okay, we know nothing about how that reversal, it's almost like the poles reverse, and how that then potentially changes the way these cognitive resources are drawn on to use each of the languages. There's a very active debate in the bilingual literature about whether young heritage speakers should maintain their home language, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting that they should, and that it may benefit the acquisition of literacy. How executive function and cognitive function in general potentially support those processes, I think, is something that we need to investigate.
Ken Papp. I resonated to many of the points that Virginia made, and I'll comment only on one, having to do with task impurity and the lack of convergence. This depresses me to no end, and my favorite example is a study reported by Salthouse, who used the 2 versions of the flanker task, arrows and letters, 265 participants, 3 different age ranges, and the correlation is 0.03. So, and earlier you also mentioned the different versions of the Stroop interference effect don't correlate as well. Until our colleagues in executive functioning solve the tool problem for us, I'd like to revisit and encourage a recommendation that we made in the Papp and Greenberg article, and more recently in our Cortex article, that we ought to really encourage everyone to use multiple measures of the same component that they wish to investigate when comparing different types of bilinguals and or different types of monolinguals.
I think that's quite consistent with what what I was sort of getting at with this. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Barbara Pearson from UMass and University of Miami. I have a question for Judy. I don't know whether it's too ignorant a question, but hopefully it'll get somebody in the audience thinking about how to answer it. I'm interested in a time scale that's longer than the immediate. You were talking about the suppression by using L1 and then L2, and that it lasted throughout the experiment, but then they recovered. I'm thinking about a short term. It doesn't last their whole life, but something, is there any study that we can look at brain, I don't even know how we would do it, but brain, some brain trace of this dampening effect, so that if we wanted to explain why that 5-year-old, when they go to school, can get rid of that other language so fast? Is there some kind of active suppression that we can see? And is there something that might at least explain or let us look for some basis for it?
I don't think we really know the answer to that. I mean, I think there are a lot of questions about how these suppression mechanisms that we talk about in these experiments are related. There are a number of people in the audience who are expert in issues of language attrition, for example, and how we think about when these inhibitory effects lead to attrition and when they're simple suppression that are effects that are momentary and that bounce back and recover later on. I think we don't know that. I think with children who are faced with this kind of immersion in a school situation, particularly where the school language is the majority language and where their home language is the minority language, is confounded with a whole set of other factors that make it, I think, not a simple
Yeah, a lot of affective factors.
address.
They really want that language and they don't want the other one, right? Also. But okay, thank you. Those people who study that, find me.
I would like, I'm sorry, I'm Erica Hoff, Florida Atlantic University. I'm interested in your expert advice about how to interpret the following result, which happens several times, several places in the literature. And that is, the question the study is addressing is, do bilinguals differ from monolinguals in executive function? Given that executive function is multifaceted, given the kind of concern about measurement, then the study uses 3, 4, 5, 6 different executive function tasks with the monolinguals and the bilinguals. And then the result is there is a difference on some measures, but not on other measures. Now, on the one hand, you might interpret that as saying, well, there's no such thing as executive function and you should stop talking about this. On the other hand, you could interpret it as, well, we have isolated the component of executive function that is affected by bilingualism. And I think that is an interesting question and a laudable goal, but it gets very glib if from one study to the next you're always discovering and you're never predicting. Anyway, I just want expert advice on what to do with that dilemma.
So I think this is sort of where my stuff comes in, where you really want to have a model of what these tasks are really measuring and how they're interrelated. And if there are different components in those data, if your pattern of effects is really lining up with that. If it, on the other hand, it's maybe, one task from this construct, one task from this, and then the other ones, then I think that would not be particularly compelling evidence that you were influencing the executive function. And maybe there was something about those particular tasks that was showing an effect, and you might want to perhaps come up with a hypothesis and test that, but, short of that, I think it is difficult to interpret. So I guess it would depend on the tasks in particular.
But I would just like to add something. I think that one of the things that's very frustrating about the current literature is that we humans have a bias towards democracy mentally. No, I'm serious. And so we count up and we say, here are 100 studies, and here are 80 that show something, 20 that don't, or 80 tasks that do, or however you want to divide it up. And in the end, scientifically and intellectually, it's not democracy. It's about the quality of those tasks, and it's about the models that we have for relating them to one another. So it may be that we go out and I can take an experiment that's not going to show an effect, and I can replicate it 100 times. And is it a more compelling failure to replicate because it's been 100 times? I think not. And I think part of the problem is we need to have an underlying story about how these different functions and just the complexity that Naomi was talking about. And I think right now we often don't have that, and we often bow to the democracy of rule, even when it's not going to provide the most intellectually compelling conclusion. The other point that I want to make has to do with studies that compare bilinguals and monolinguals on executive function tasks, which is my read of the literature, and I won't say that I've read every single study, but I've read a lot of them, is that very few of the studies that compare bilinguals and monolinguals on cognitive tasks actually use sensitive language processing measures. And of course, we can argue in the same way about the executive function tasks about which language processing measure, and should it be about the lexicon or the grammar, should it be comprehension, should it be production? We can get into a whole debate about that. But the point is that most of these measures most of these papers use a language, like a subjective language history questionnaire. And I want to argue that we're at a moment in time where that's not sensitive enough. So both of these things, I think, need to hold.
I'm going to give a slightly dissenting view. I've had the same reaction that you've had, Erica, in reading a lot of the studies. And what I would like to see more of is follow-up experiments in which something that shows an effect on a particular task is investigated again more deeply with a tweak here or there, so that the same basic thing can be gotten at in consecutive experiments to try to get more of a handle on it. So one thing I find frustrating about the literature is that a task in one experiment is different in a subtle way that you don't know how to interpret from a task in another experiment. So you can't really evaluate whether, so you get a Stroop effect in experiment 1 and you don't get a Stroop effect in experiment 2, but you don't know whether it's because the effect is inherently unstable or because there's something about the particular stimuli. And so I'd like to see a much more systematic and even boring parametric manipulation of variables to see what's going on. I think it's also the case that most studies are underpowered. It's not the case for all studies, but most of them are underpowered. And even experiments that have a large number of subjects. So at this point, I think we've run like 500 subjects, but we divide them into 7 different language groups depending on a very complex set of criteria. And so once we do that and we've got different conditions, well, in any given condition, we've only got 15 to 20 subjects, say, and that's probably not enough to really be exploring the question. So I do think there's a failure of using big enough samples, and also a failure to keep going after a particular experimental finding. But from a probability hacking perspective, you expect that not every experiment is going to show results. So the more suspicious experiments are the ones where you've got 5 different versions and they're all showing something, because the odds of that happening just on a statistical basis are very small. So it gets more complicated the more you look at it. Say who you are.
Hi, my name is Deborah Titone. I'm at McGill, and thank you so much for this very interesting session. I had a question for Naomi Friedman. I was really struck in the data that you presented how much of the variance was explained by the genetic component, and you had mentioned that you can't exclude gene-environment interactions. And I wondered how do you go about doing that in point of practice, and why? If you have gene-environment interactions, does it eat away from the environmental component rather than the genetic component?
So I actually, was talking about, I think gene-environment correlation are more confounded with the genetic variance than perhaps the interaction. So just the tendency that people who are actually already maybe genetically good at executive functions to use those executive functions more, perhaps seek out environments that would actually take advantage of those. But the reason is just that because you have that sort of correlation. So the limits of the kind of modeling that I was doing is that you don't have that much information going into the model. So you have monozygotic and dizygotic twins. You don't have any information about their kind of environmental exposures or things like that. So the way that you would try to get at that is maybe to add that kind of information into your model to see, okay, let's say we have a candidate environmental experience that we think could actually influence this ability, like, I don't know, video game playing or musical training or something like that. If we had a measure of that, we could ask, well, to what extent is the level of that actually influenced also by genes? If that were also, there was some genetic variance in this putative environmental factor, then that would start to get us at a model where we could say maybe that is an environmental factor that is also genetically influenced and maybe contributing to that genetic variance. And then, of course, you could actually estimate whether it even predicted in that model as well.
But you never have people, I'm just curious, you never have people in your samples that are genetically related but in completely different environments, right?
Well, so that's why we sort of separate out the environment into that C and E term, so that, yes, they grow up together. But even children who grow up together have quite different exposures at some point in their life, and especially once they move out and are no longer living together. So we can sort of get at some of that, and we have other samples as well. I mean, not just me, but other genetic researchers where you have things like adoption studies where you have the same environment but different genes and basically every permutation that you can think of.
Okay, I just often wonder if people who are identical twins, there's a lot of expectation that they should be similar within a family, but thank you very much.
One thing I'd add to that is research by Turkheimer and colleagues that some of you may know about, showing effects of SES on heritability in IQ. So if you look at very low SES children, almost none of the variability in IQ can be attributed to genes. And if you look at high SES people, children, so we're talking about 7-year-olds, almost all of the variability in IQ can be attributed to genes. So the reason for that is heritability is a ratio, and the hypothesis is that among high SES children, the environments are relatively similar. So the only thing that's left that can vary is the genetic part. Whereas in low SES children, the environments vary tremendously, and so the environment takes up almost all of the variance. So unless you're actually manipulating things like SES and other variables that you know make a difference between groups, it's going to be hard to be confident, I would say, in executive functions as well as IQ, how to partial out the different aspects of gene shared and common and individual environments.
Thomas Bach from Edinburgh. A question to Naomi. I mean, one of the kind of clinically most popular frontal executive functions is generation, like verbal fluency and so on. I mean, producing as many words, concepts, and so on and so on. I was wondering, how does this relate to, I mean, inhibition, switching, and so on, to the components that you discussed? Because, as I say, in the clinical reality, that's one of the things which is probably most prominent in many of diseases.
So I haven't looked at that in detail. We do have some fluency measures in our twin sample, and it looks like it's just not really cleanly related to, I mean, it looks like it might be separable. Maybe there's some common part of it, but I don't recall that it was clearly related to anything. So I think I looked at this very quickly in the context of a grant application, and so it's been a while since I looked at that. But I think that would be a candidate for looking at maybe whether we would need separate tasks to look at something like that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Say who you are.
My name is Megan Gross, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm really interested in code switching in bilingual children. So shifting is of particular interest to me. And Dr. Friedman, I was interested in your revised model where shifting specific skills are separated from common EF and how mixing costs tend to pattern with common EF and not necessarily shifting skills. And also your work in looking at how these are related to other skills, and sometimes common EF and shifting don't pattern in the same way. And so I'm interested in the implications of this for bilinguals because both of these are related to that experience. In a single language context, you need to be stable, but when you have to switch languages, you need to be flexible. And so I'm curious if these have implications for comparisons on mixing costs and switching costs between bilinguals and monolinguals, because some studies find differences on switching costs and other studies find differences on mixing costs. And could this be related to the kinds of bilinguals that are involved in those studies and the adaptive control hypothesis? So if either of you have thoughts about that, I'd be interested to hear them.
Yeah, we actually, I don't know, Sophia's here somewhere. Yes, Sofia Vinieska. So we have a very large study where we're just looking at these switching and mixing costs for bilinguals who are either balanced in the two languages or dominant in their native language. And in fact, you can show that there are some dissociations between these measures. So again, there are these different measures of regulation. Like the set of issues around executive function, we have ways, I think, of beginning to separate where we see mixing costs really for everyone. The mixing costs are really quite pervasive. The switching costs and the direction of the switching costs are much more variable. And again, I think it's a clue to then begin to track how those are going to predict something about the way these regulatory mechanisms are engaged, and then how those effects are drawing on the resources that we've been talking about cognitively. I think it's a really important point.
Okay, at this point, Irina Sakarina has a few logistic items to impart.